I returned home earlier than anyone expected. I wanted to surprise my wife for Christmas, but the surprise that waited for me was one I would never forget. It was late evening, the kind of cold that makes the air sting your cheeks and the snow sound crisp under your boots. My flight from Toronto had landed 2 hours earlier. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back. After 3 weeks away negotiating an expansion deal for my company, Callahan Timberworks, I wanted to walk into my home and see my wife's face light up with joy. We had always loved Christmas in Ohio, the lights, the smell of pine, the quiet snow over Lake Erie. It was supposed to be peaceful. When the taxi turned down the long driveway, I saw the house from a distance glowing, alive, every window lit. For a moment, I smiled. Margaret's hosting another charity dinner, I thought. She loved decorating early, baking cookies for the neighbors, putting on Bing Crosby records while she cooked. That warmth was what kept me grounded all these years. But as the cab stopped near the gate, I heard something I didn't expect. Laughter. Loud, careless laughter. It came from inside, echoing through the frosty air. A man's voice, young, self-satisfied. And then clinking glasses, someone making a toast. I frowned. It didn't sound like Margaret's voice at all. It sounded like a celebration. I paid the driver, told him to keep the change, and carried my suitcase up the path. The snow crunched beneath my boots. The closer I got, the clearer the voices became. My son's voice, unmistakable even after months of distance. Ethan. I stopped. He wasn't supposed to be here. He and his wife Lydia were spending Christmas with her family in Cincinnati. That was the plan, or at least what they told us. So why was he in my house now, days before Christmas, laughing like a man who owned the place? I stepped onto the porch. Through the front window, I could see the Christmas tree, tall, silver ornaments shimmering under soft yellow lights. And there, near the fireplace, stood Ethan with a glass of champagne, his arm around Lydia, surrounded by her parents, Harris and Julia Monroe. The Monroes, dressed like royalty even in my living room, were toasting with smug smiles. And then my eyes moved to the right, to the balcony door. Margaret stood there, outside in the cold, a thin shawl over her shoulders. Her eyes were red. She wasn't part of their laughter. She wasn't smiling. She was crying silently, looking at the snow falling over the lake. Something in me cracked, but I didn't move. I just watched her, my wife of 37 years, standing alone outside her own home while strangers celebrated inside. Nobody noticed her pain. Nobody cared. They were too busy drinking my wine, standing under my roof, toasting to something I didn't yet understand. I stayed in the shadows by the porch, letting the truth settle like ice through my chest. I didn't need to hear every word. I already knew. That wasn't just a family visit. It was something else, something calculated. Margaret's shoulders trembled as she wiped her tears and turned slightly toward the window, as if searching for someone who wasn't there. I took a slow breath and whispered to myself, "I'm here, Maggie. I'm home." But I didn't walk inside. Not yet. Because in that moment, I understood that whatever was happening in that warm, bright living room had already been planned long before I arrived. And I needed to know how deep it went before I made my next move. Let me tell you how a man who built his fortune from sawdust and sweat returned home to find his family replaced by imposters in expensive clothes, and how, that Christmas, revenge was carved with precision, sharp enough to cut through betrayal itself. To understand that night, the night I found my wife crying while my son laughed with strangers, you have to know where it all began. Because betrayal doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows quietly, like rot under good wood, until the surface finally cracks. My name is Richard Callahan. I'm 67 years old, and I built Callahan Timberworks from nothing but raw hands and faith. When I was 25, I was fresh out of the Navy, broke, and living in a one-room apartment in Toledo, Ohio. I had no college degree, no fancy connections, just an old pickup, a few tools, and a stubborn belief that if I made something with integrity, people would see its value. The first year was brutal. I made custom tables and chairs in a garage that flooded every spring. I worked 12 hours a day, and slept 4. And every morning, before the sun came up, Margaret would bring me coffee and smile like she knew something I didn't like. She could already see the life we were building even when I couldn't. We got married in that garage. No tuxedos, no orchestra, just 2 kids who believed hard work was enough to hold the world together. And somehow it was. Over the next 3 decades, that garage turned into a factory. That factory turned into 6 showrooms, and Callahan Timberworks became a name people recognized from Cleveland to Chicago. The business specialized in artisan woodcraft, high-end custom furniture, boats, and home interiors made from reclaimed Ohio oak. By the time I turned 60, the company was worth over $50 million, employing 200 people. But the real pride wasn't the money. It was that every inch of that empire came from our effort, mine and Margaret's, built plank by plank, hour by hour. And in all that time, there was only one thing we ever truly wanted: a family legacy. Our son Ethan. He was born during the hardest years, when I was still building furniture by hand, and Margaret cleaned offices at night to help pay the bills. He was a beautiful boy, bright, curious, gentle. Margaret adored him. I did too, though I wasn't always around to show it. When I wasn't working in the shop, I was traveling to find clients. She was the heart, I was the engine. Together, we kept everything running. But success changes people, sometimes even those who didn't earn it. As Ethan grew, I gave him every opportunity I never had: private schools, design programs, summers in Europe studying architecture. I thought I was giving him freedom. In truth, I was giving him detachment. He learned to appreciate beauty, but not the cost behind it. He loved ideas, not effort. When Lydia Monroe entered his life, I should have seen the storm coming. She was polished, ambitious, from an old Cincinnati family, the kind who wore wealth like perfume. Her parents, Harris and Julia, made their fortune in real estate. The first time I met them, Harris shook my hand like he was inspecting a new employee. Julia called Margaret dear, in that sweet way rich women do when they're already judging you. They smiled too much, asked too many questions about the company, and said things like, "Ethan will take over one day, won't he?" It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. After the wedding, the distance began. Ethan started calling less. Christmas visits turned into excuses. "We're spending the holidays with Lydia's family this year, Dad. You understand, right?" And every time he needed money for a business idea, a house, an emergency, I helped, because that's what fathers do, right? I told myself it was generosity. Looking back, it was guilt for not being around enough when he was young. Margaret never complained. But I saw how her smile changed when his name came up. She'd say, "He's just busy, Richard. He'll come around." She believed it every time, until belief started to sound like denial. 4 years ago, Ethan moved to Cincinnati permanently. He said he wanted to explore opportunities. What that really meant was, Lydia's family had bigger plans. After that, everything between us turned quiet. Polite, distant. We became the parents you call for birthdays and thank you checks. Still, I never thought he'd cross the line between neglect and betrayal. But when I left for my trip to Canada that December, when I kissed Margaret goodbye and promised to be back before Christmas, the line had already been crossed. And I was too blind to see it. For 35 years, I built something unbreakable. For 35 years, I thought loyalty was automatic, that blood was enough to bind a family. But that night, standing outside my own house, watching my wife cry alone, while my son toasted with thieves, I learned the hardest truth a father can learn. Loyalty isn't inherited. It's earned. And sometimes, the people you raise with love are the first ones to sell it. The wind cut through my coat as I stood on that porch, trying to understand what I was seeing. The laughter from inside was too loud, too careless, too confident. It wasn't the sound of family. It was the sound of victory. I moved slowly, quietly, toward the side of the house where the sliding glass door led to the living room. From there, I could see everything through the reflection of the Christmas tree lights. Lydia was standing near the fireplace, her champagne glass raised, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who'd already won. "To new beginnings," she said, voice smooth and polished. "To finally taking the next step for the family." Her father, Harris Monroe, chuckled. "You mean for your family, darling. But yes, to progress. The Callahan name will finally have the leadership it deserves." Ethan laughed, nervous and small. He looked uncomfortable, but not enough to stop what was happening. "Dad won't understand this," he muttered. Lydia turned sharply. "He doesn't have to understand. He's 70. He built something incredible, yes, but he's holding it back now. You said it yourself. He's tired. He doesn't even know half of what goes on in the company anymore." That was a lie, and they all knew it. I'd just returned from signing new distribution contracts, expansions they could only dream of, but none of that mattered. They weren't talking about management. They were talking about ownership. Harris leaned back in my leather chair, the same one I'd sat in for decades, to write paychecks for my workers. "The paperwork is done," he said, casual, as if discussing a golf game. "Once Margaret signs, the trust transfers everything, the company, the lake house, the remaining shares under Ethan's name. It's a formality now." I felt my pulse thud in my ears. Once Margaret signs. Margaret. My wife, who'd spent 35 years beside me through every storm, now crying alone on the porch, probably because she already knew what was happening. Because they had cornered her, manipulated her, used my absence to twist her loyalty. Lydia smirked. "She'll sign tomorrow morning. I told her it's for tax protection, to avoid inheritance complications. She doesn't understand half of it. Poor woman still thinks you and your father will talk it out." Julia Monroe sipped her wine, smiling faintly. "She's soft-hearted. Once she signs, it's done. No going back. The house, the company, all under Ethan's control. You can handle everything from there." Ethan frowned. "I don't want to trick her, Mom. She's my mother." Lydia shot him a look that could slice marble. "And what do you call letting your father keep running things until he dies? Charity? You're his son. This is your inheritance. Just a little earlier than planned. Besides, I've already talked to the attorneys. It's perfectly legal." Harris nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Nothing illegal. Just estate planning. And if old Richard objects, well, the paperwork will already be filed." The room laughed again. And there it was, the sound I'll never forget. That laugh. Lydia's mother's delicate snicker, Lydia's confident smirk, Harris's self-satisfied chuckle, and Ethan, my own blood, joining in weakly, letting it happen. They clinked glasses. "To the new owners of Callahan Timberworks," Harris declared. That was the moment I stopped breathing. My fists tightened at my sides, nails cutting into my palms. The rage that hit me wasn't fiery. It was ice cold, controlled, deadly. Because I knew if I stormed in there now, it would end in chaos, shouting, maybe even pity. No, I wasn't going to give them that. I was going to let them toast their victory. I was going to let them believe they'd already won. And then, when the papers were ready to sign, when the trap was tightest, I would take everything back in one silent move. But I needed proof, evidence. I pulled out my phone and hit record. I zoomed in through the glass, capturing every face, every word, every laugh, time-stamped, clear as day. I moved closer to the wall, barely breathing. The sound carried perfectly. Then Lydia said something that froze my blood. "Tomorrow, when Margaret signs, I'll send the documents to the attorney's office. We'll file before Richard gets back from Canada. By the time he lands, everything will be in our name. If he tries to undo it, he'll look paranoid. And once the media hears that he's transferring control to his son, it'll be public. He can't reverse it without embarrassing himself." Harris smirked. "A masterpiece, Lydia. Ruthless but elegant." Elegant. That's what they called stealing a man's life's work. Margaret appeared faintly through the glass, walking back into the living room. Her face was pale, eyes swollen. She said softly, "I'm going upstairs. I have a headache." Lydia smiled sweetly. "Of course, Mom. Rest well. Tomorrow will be a big day." As Margaret turned away, Her gaze flickered toward the window just enough for me to see her face. For a fraction of a second, I thought our eyes met, but she didn't react. Maybe she didn't see me. Maybe she was too broken to care. When she disappeared up the stairs, I stepped back from the glass. My breath clouded in the air. The laughter resumed inside, muffled now by the thick walls, and all I could hear was the beating of my own heart. That's when the decision crystallized. They thought they were the predators, circling for the kill, but they'd forgotten something essential. Wolves hunt differently than sheep. I turned toward the driveway, my boots crunching in the snow, each step deliberate, steady. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns too fast. What I felt was colder, sharper, something that could wait all night and still strike perfectly by dawn. I would not confront them tonight. I would dismantle them quietly, legally, completely. And by the time Christmas morning came, the Monroes and my son would understand what it means to cross a man who built everything with his own hands. I drove through the sleeping streets of Toledo with the heater humming softly, headlights slicing through thin ribbons of snow. The city was quiet, unaware that a man inside one of its trucks was rethinking his entire life, his family, his marriage, his legacy. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was for amateurs. What I felt was something far more dangerous: clarity. I had seen the enemy, and they were inside my home, drinking from my glasses, toasting to my death before it even came. And the worst part? They weren't strangers. They were my son and his in-laws. When I reached downtown, I parked in front of a brick building whose windows glowed faintly even at midnight. Ross and Feldman, attorneys at law. Jacob Ross, my lawyer, my friend for over 20 years, lived just above his office. I knew he'd answer. I rang once. The door opened after a few seconds. Jacob stood there in flannel pajamas and a robe, eyes tired but sharp. "Richard, it's Christmas week, for God's sake. What's going on?" "I need documents," I said. "Tonight." He blinked. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that changes everything." 5 minutes later, we were seated in his office, papers spread across the mahogany desk. I told him everything: the forged transfers, the manipulation, the laughter, the betrayal. Jacob didn't interrupt. He just listened, his expression hardening with each detail. When I finished, he leaned back. "Richard, you're saying they're trying to steal Callahan Timberworks and the house?" "They already started," I said. "The paperwork's drafted. My wife's signature is the last piece. If she signs tomorrow, I lose everything." Jacob nodded slowly. "Then we don't give them tomorrow." He pulled a stack of forms from the cabinet and started typing. "I'll revoke every power of attorney. Freeze all corporate authorizations under your name only. We'll transfer all assets, house, company, investments, into a new irrevocable trust. Margaret becomes lifetime beneficiary. You keep legal control as the trustee. That way, not even your son can touch it." "Good," I said. "And Ethan?" Jacob asked carefully. "Removed. Entirely. The new will disinherits him for cause conspiracy to defraud, coercion, breach of fiduciary trust." Jacob hesitated. "That's nuclear." I met his eyes, then let it burn. For the next 2 hours, the sound of his printer filled the office, page after page of fresh protection. I read every word, signed where needed. And by the time the clock struck 3, my world was legally untouchable. "File these first thing in the morning," I said. "Or sooner, if you can." "I'll drive them to the clerk's office myself," Jacob replied. "Richard, I've known you a long time. Are you sure about this? There's no going back once it's done." "I'm sure." I stood up, shook his hand, and left. The cold hit me like a slap, but I felt alive again, in control, awake. And I wasn't finished. My next call was to Victor HIL, the head of security who had installed the alarm systems at my workshops and the house. He owed me a favor. "Victor, I need the locks changed. Every door, every code, every camera access. Tonight." "Tonight?" "Richard, it's almost 4 a.m. I'll pay triple. You'll get a $5,000 bonus if it's done before sunrise." Silence, then a short laugh. For that price, I'll bring my whole crew. Good. No one gets in after today without my authorization. Not even family. By the time I hung up, I was already driving again, not toward the house, but toward the lakeside hotel just outside the city. Margaret needed to be away before morning. If she stayed, Lydia and her parents would corner her again. I couldn't let that happen. I called the hotel manager, a man named Alan who'd worked for me for years. Alan, I need your presidential suite. Tonight. Under another name. Quietly. Of course, Mr. Callahan. Should I prepare it? Yes. And send a car to my house at dawn. Pick up Mrs. Callahan, no questions. Tell her I asked for her personally. I ended the call, sat there for a moment, and stared at the snow falling on the windshield. The world outside looked calm, peaceful, but inside me, something relentless had awakened. It wasn't vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was protection of Margaret, of everything we had built with our hands. At 6 a.m., I was outside the house again, parked across the street, engine off. Through the windows, I saw the faint glow of morning. The Monroes were still asleep inside. Ethan, too. I waited until the black town car Alan sent rolled quietly into the driveway. Minutes later, I saw Margaret step out the front door. She looked exhausted, fragile. She carried a small bag and hesitated at the steps, glancing back toward the house. Then, as if deciding she couldn't bear another minute there, she got into the car and left. I followed from a distance, making sure she arrived safely at the hotel. When she stepped into the lobby and saw me waiting, she froze. "Richard?" Her voice trembled. "I'm here," I said softly. "You're safe now." The tears came before she could speak. I held her as she shook in my arms, whispering fragments of fear and guilt. "They said you wanted this, that it was for your retirement. They said you told Ethan." "I told Ethan nothing," I interrupted. "They lied, Margaret. They used your heart against you." She looked up at me, broken. I didn't know what to do. "You did the right thing," I said. "You didn't sign. That's all that matters. Now, let me handle the rest." Her breathing steadied. "What are you going to do?" "Justice," I said quietly. "Cold, clean, legal, and final." That night, while she slept in the safety of that hotel suite, I sat at the desk overlooking Lake Erie, my phone buzzing with updates. By 4 a.m., Victor confirmed the locks were changed and the new security system active. At 5, Jacob texted, "Filed. It's official." At 5:15, the sheriff's office confirmed standby readiness for a property eviction. By sunrise, every door in my life was either locked or legally fortified, every weak link sealed. They thought they could strip my family name for profit, but what they didn't understand was simple. You can't steal from a man who's already built everything twice in his life. You can only teach him how to build again, and I was about to rebuild my family's peace, with precision sharp enough to make them wish they'd never lifted a pen. The sun rose pale over Lake Erie, brushing the snow in soft gold. It should have been a peaceful Christmas morning, the kind where Margaret and I used to wake to the smell of coffee, wrapped in blankets, laughing at the thought of another quiet year together. But that morning was different. That morning, peace came wearing a badge. 2 patrol cars idled quietly near the driveway, their blue lights muted in the dawn. Sheriff Collins, a man who'd known me since the first factory opened, stood beside me, arms folded, breath turning to fog. "You're sure about this, Richard?" he asked softly. "I'm sure." Behind him, my lawyer, Jacob Ross, stepped out of his SUV, thick folder under his arm. "Everything's filed," he said. "The trust, the disinheritance, the eviction order. You're covered from every angle." "Good," I replied. "Let's finish this." The house looked beautiful from the outside, warm lights glowing behind frosted windows, garlands still hanging over the porch. Inside, though, I knew the rot waited. My son, his wife, her parents. People who had toasted to my end less than 12 hours earlier. I walked to the front door with the sheriff beside me and knocked firmly. Not a hesitant knock, a declaration. Inside, I heard movement. A man's voice muttered something, then footsteps shuffled toward the door. When it opened, Ethan stood there in flannel pants and a t-shirt, his hair a mess, his expression confused. "Dad?" he said, blinking at the officers behind me. What's going on?" "Merry Christmas," I said calmly. "You're leaving." He frowned. "Leaving? What are you talking about?" He stopped as Jacob handed him a paper. "This," Jacob said flatly, "is a formal eviction notice, filed at 4:12 a.m. this morning. You and all other occupants are required to vacate this property immediately." Ethan stared, uncomprehending. "This is insane. This is my parents' house. I grew up here." "And it's mine," I replied. "Still is. Always was. And none of you have my permission to be here." Behind him, Lydia appeared in a silk robe, her hair perfect even at dawn. Her tone dripped with arrogance. "You can't do this, Richard. This is our family home. Ethan's your son." "No," I said quietly. "This was my home. You turned it into a crime scene." She scoffed. "Crime scene? Don't be dramatic." I reached into my coat and held up my phone. The screen played the video I'd recorded the night before. Lydia's voice, crystal clear. "Tomorrow, when Margaret signs, the house will be ours." Every word echoed through the hallway. Lydia's face drained of color. "Officer," I said, "you heard the recording. Fraud, coercion, and conspiracy. Remove them." Ethan stepped forward, panic rising in his voice. "Dad, stop. This is a misunderstanding. We just wanted to—" "Stop," I cut him off. "You wanted control. You wanted money. You wanted everything your mother and I built with our hands, while you were busy pretending you were too good to earn any of it. Now you can keep pretending somewhere else." Sheriff Collins nodded to his deputies. "You heard the man. Gather your things." Julia Monroe stormed down the stairs, her husband behind her, both livid. "This is harassment," she snapped. "We'll sue." Jacob's voice was calm but lethal. "You can try, but since your daughter's on record admitting attempted fraud, I'd advise saving your money for legal fees." Within 30 minutes, the Monroes were loading their luggage into the snow. Lydia was cursing under her breath, shouting orders at Ethan, who just stood there, frozen, ashamed. As the deputies escorted them to their car, I stepped onto the porch. "Ethan," I said quietly, "look at me." He did. His eyes were glassy. "Your mother cried last night, out there on that porch, while you were laughing inside. That's what I'll remember every time I think of you." "Dad, I didn't mean—" "Don't call me Dad," I said. "You don't earn that title by blood. You earn it by loyalty." The sheriff gave me a small nod. "It's done, Richard." I watched as their cars rolled down the drive, the sound of tires crunching through the snow fading into distance. When the last one disappeared behind the trees, silence filled the air. No laughter, no lies, no poison, just the wind and the soft creak of frozen branches. Jacob approached. "It's over." "Not yet," I said. "It's never over until peace returns." Inside, the house was a mess, empty bottles, half-eaten food, expensive coats thrown over my furniture. I cleaned quietly, piece by piece, until the rooms looked like my home again. Every motion deliberate, slow, cleansing. When I finally stepped outside again, the sky had turned pale pink. Across the lake, sunlight shimmered on the water, like forgiveness trying to reach me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel relieved. I felt something deeper, the calm that comes after a storm that never should have happened. That morning, I didn't unwrap gifts or drink coffee by the fire. I unwrapped the truth, and it was heavier than anything I'd ever built. But at least now, the house was mine again. Mine and Margaret's. And no one would ever make her cry in it again. The first night after the eviction was the quietest night our house had known in years. No voices, no laughter, no music, just the sound of the wind moving through the pine trees outside and the creak of the old beams in the ceiling. the same beams I'd sanded by hand 30 years ago. Margaret and I sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of untouched tea between us. She kept glancing toward the window, as if expecting Ethan's car to pull back into the driveway, headlights flashing, his voice shouting some kind of apology that never came. It didn't. She finally broke the silence. "You did what you had to do," she said softly, almost like she was trying to convince herself. I didn't answer right away. I was still hearing the echoes of that morning, Lydia's angry shouts, Ethan's pleading, the crunch of tires over snow as they left. Every sound was carved into my memory. "Maybe," I said finally, "but doing what's right doesn't always feel right." Margaret looked tired, not the kind of tired you fix with sleep, but the kind that settles deep in your bones. "He's still our son," she whispered. I stared down at my hands. He was our son, until he decided we were just obstacles in his inheritance. Her lips trembled. "You really believe he planned all of it?" "I don't have to believe it," I said quietly. "I heard it." She pressed a hand to her chest, tears forming again. "I should have seen it coming. I should have stopped it." "No," I said, reaching across the table and taking her hand. "You shouldn't blame yourself for trusting your own child. That's what decent people do, Margaret. We trust. They just forgot how to deserve it." Her hand was cold in mine, fragile like porcelain. "I don't know how to live in this house anymore," she said. "Every corner reminds me of him. The staircase, the porch, his old room. It's like the whole place is haunted by someone who isn't dead." Her words cut deeper than she knew. Because she was right. The silence in the house wasn't peace, it was absence. An absence you could feel like gravity. Over the next few days, the calls started coming. Lydia first angry, then desperate. Then her parents threatening lawsuits, claiming slander, playing victims. And finally, Ethan. He left voicemails. The first, full of denial. The second, regret. The third, just silence. A few breaths, a sigh, and the click of a call ending. I never called back. Jacob handled the legal fallout swiftly. The Monrose's lawyers reviewed the filings and realized the case was airtight. There would be no lawsuits, no appeals, nothing. By New Year's, everything had gone quiet again. Too quiet. Margaret began avoiding the living room, where the Christmas tree still stood. The lights had dimmed, but she refused to take it down, maybe because taking it down would make the memory permanent. Sometimes, I'd catch her standing by the window, staring at the driveway, the way she used to wait for me when I came home from work. Only this time, she was waiting for a son who wasn't coming back. One evening, I walked out onto the balcony, the same balcony where she'd cried that night, and watched the lake turning dark beneath a silver sky. She joined me without saying a word. After a long silence, she said, "Do you ever wonder if we failed him?" I turned to look at her. "Every day." She nodded slowly. "Me too." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "But failure doesn't justify betrayal. He made a choice, Margaret. Maybe the hardest part of being a parent is learning that you can't protect your child from his own character." She leaned her head against me, her voice barely a whisper. "Then what do we do now?" "We live," I said. "We live with what's left, with each other, with peace that doesn't need permission." She closed her eyes. "And if he ever comes back?" I hesitated. "Then we'll see who he's become. But until then, no contact, not a word." We stayed like that for a while, the snow falling around us, the lake stretching out into quiet infinity. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't healing either. It was survival, the slow kind that comes after you've done what you had to do and are left wondering if it cost too much. That night, before bed, I looked at the empty space where Ethan's childhood photos used to hang. I had taken them down earlier that day, not out of anger, but because sometimes love hurts too much to look at directly. And for the first time in decades, I locked every door in my home, not out of fear of what might come in, but of what might try to come back. A year passed after that Christmas. Life went on, but not in the way it used to. The company was stable again, the trust secure, the lawyers satisfied. On paper, everything was perfect. But in reality, I lived like a man, walking through the ruins of something beautiful, safe, yes, but empty. Margaret tried to heal, and so did I, though healing looked different for both of us. She spent more time at the local community center, helping veterans' families and teaching young mothers about budgeting. I threw myself into work, rebuilding Callahan Timberworks from the inside, tightening every policy, retraining managers, removing anyone connected to Ethan's name. But every night, when the lights were off and the world went quiet, I'd still see his face. The way he looked at me that morning, disbelief, fear, guilt, all mixed into one. And even though I told myself justice had been served, something in me refused to rest. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was intuition. It was early December, almost a year to the day since the eviction, when Jacob Ross called unexpectedly. "Richard," he said, his tone strangely cautious, "there's something I think you need to see. Can you stop by the office?" I drove there immediately, my stomach sinking for reasons I couldn't name. When I arrived, Jacob didn't waste time with small talk. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "It came from a third-party courier," he said. "No return address, but the handwriting looked familiar." I opened the envelope. Inside were printed copies of emails, dozens of them, dated from the week before the betrayal. My eyes scanned quickly at first, then slowed. They were from Margaret. To Jacob. Subject lines: concerns, Richard's safety, please advise. Jacob cleared his throat. "I never received them. Lydia must have intercepted or deleted them before they hit my inbox. I only recovered them last week when a cybersecurity audit flagged an unknown filter." I started reading. "Jacob, I'm worried about what Ethan and Lydia are planning. They keep talking about the company and the house. Harris is here more often than Richard knows. Something isn't right. If anything happens, please make sure Richard's signature can't be forged. I think they want me to sign papers I don't understand. Please don't let them hurt him. Please protect him." The words blurred as I kept reading. Dozens of emails, each one more desperate. Margaret had seen everything long before I came home. She'd been trying to warn me, to protect me, to block their plans in any way she could. And I had thought she was powerless, broken, manipulated. But she wasn't. She'd been fighting in silence. When I looked up, Jacob was watching me carefully. "She never told you, did she?" I shook my head. My throat felt tight. "No, she let me believe she was helpless." Jacob leaned forward. "She wasn't. When you revoked those documents that night, part of what made it all go through so smoothly was because the preliminary filings Lydia had prepared were incomplete. Margaret delayed them. She lied to their lawyer, said you hadn't approved certain forms, even removed key pages from the file. Without her stalling, they would have succeeded before you ever got home." I sat back in my chair, silent. For a long moment, all I could do was stare at the stack of papers. My wife, the woman I thought had been crying out of weakness, had been quietly protecting me the entire time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went to her study, where she kept her charity files, and found her sitting by the fire, knitting something for the local children's drive. "Margaret," I said quietly, "we need to talk." She looked up, her face calm but cautious. "About what?" I placed the envelope on the coffee table. "About this." She stared at it for a long second, then set her knitting down. "You found them?" "Yes. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you already had too much to carry," she said simply. "You were working, traveling, managing the company. I didn't want to add more stress until I had proof." "Proof? Margaret, you were the proof. They were destroying everything we built, and you were standing in the fire alone." Her eyes softened. "I wasn't alone. I knew you'd come home. I just needed to hold them off long enough." I sat beside her, the guilt washing over me. All this time, I thought you were the one who needed protecting, but it was you who protected me. She smiled faintly, a tear rolling down her cheek. "We protect each other, Richard. That's how it's always been." For the first time in months, I didn't see her as fragile. I saw her as the woman who once stood beside me in a flooded garage holding a hammer and a dream. The woman who'd never backed down from anything. But the surprises weren't over. 3 days later, Jacob called again. "Richard, there's one more thing you should know." "What now?" "Your operations director, Catherine Ortiz, you remember her?" "Of course. Margaret's friend. She helped at the foundation." "Well," Jacob said, "I reviewed the timeline. Catherine was feeding Harris Monroe false information the entire time, deliberately misleading him about your travel dates, about your assets, about the trust structure. It looks like she was working with Margaret to confuse them, keep them off balance." I blinked. "Catherine?" "Yes. She risked her job doing it. Harris trusted her because she handled logistics for the company. She sent him fake drafts of agreements and incorrect numbers. It's partly why their plan fell apart. They were chasing false data." I sat in silence, letting it all sink in. The betrayal that had once seemed so complete had cracks in it, cracks filled with quiet acts of loyalty from the people I'd underestimated. Margaret, Catherine, even Jacob, who had stayed up that night filing those papers. While the Monroes were conspiring, my own circle, silent, patient, steadfast, was already defending me in ways I didn't see. That night, I stood again on the balcony overlooking the lake, the winter wind biting at my face. Margaret joined me after a moment, slipping her hand into mine. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew the whole time what they were doing." "I suspected," she said softly. "But I also knew you'd come home when it mattered. You always do." I turned to her. "I don't deserve you." She smiled. "Then spend the rest of your life proving you do." The snow fell gently around us, the same as the night I first saw her crying there, only this time, her tears were gone. Because what I thought had been weakness was, in truth, quiet strength. And that realization changed everything. It was almost 2 years after that fateful Christmas when I heard Ethan's name again. I was in the workshop behind the main house, sanding an old piece of walnut for a charity auction. The smell of wood always calmed me. It reminded me of the years before. Money complicated everything, when it was just Margaret and me, two dreamers building something that mattered. The phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first, but when I answered, the voice on the other end made my chest tighten. "Dad?" It was Ethan. I didn't speak. For a moment, I couldn't. The sound of his voice after 2 years felt foreign, older, softer, maybe even humbled. "Dad, please don't hang up," he said quickly. "I'm not calling to ask for money or favors. I need to talk." I exhaled slowly. "You've got 2 minutes. "I deserve that," he said. "Look, I've been working at a small design firm in Columbus. Nothing glamorous, but it's honest work. I've been trying to rebuild, to be someone Mom could be proud of." My grip on the phone loosened slightly. "How's your family?" He hesitated. "Lydia and I divorced last year. She took her parents' money and left. The kids, Mason and Ella, live with me most of the time. I think losing everything might have saved me." I said nothing. He continued, voice trembling. "Dad, I know there's no excuse for what I did. I betrayed you. I let greed turn me into something unrecognizable. But I'm not that man anymore. I work 12-hour days. I pay my rent on time. I volunteer on weekends teaching design to underprivileged students. I wanted you to know that." I stared out the workshop window. The lake shimmered under a thin layer of ice, silent and still. "Why tell me this now?" "Because," he said quietly, "the kids ask about you, about Grandma, and I don't know what to tell them anymore. I don't want them to grow up thinking family ends when you make a mistake." The words hit harder than I expected. "Finally," I said, "if you mean what you say, then you'll prove it with time, not words." "I will," he said. "Even if you never forgive me, I'll still try." And then, softly, "Tell Mom I love her." The line went dead. I stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the old heater and the creak of the wood beneath my boots. A part of me wanted to stay angry. It was easier, safer. But another part, the one that still remembered holding Ethan as a boy, whispered that maybe, just maybe, some lessons had been learned the hard way. When I told Margaret later that evening, she cried, "He called you first?" she asked. "Yes." She smiled faintly through her tears. "Then he's finally growing up." We didn't call him back. Not yet. Forgiveness couldn't be rushed. But something in the air had shifted. The silence between us and our son was no longer poisoned. It was healing. Months passed. Spring came. Then summer. We started receiving letters from Ethan, not long ones, just small updates. Handwritten, humble. He'd include drawings from the kids, notes about their school projects, sometimes even photos of their weekend hikes. Margaret pinned them to the refrigerator, each one a quiet step toward reconciliation. Then, one day in early autumn, a letter arrived, not for me but for her. Inside was a photograph. Ethan, standing beside a newly finished community center he'd designed for veterans. Below the photo, in neat handwriting, were just 3 lines. "I wanted to build something that lasts. Something I could be proud of again. Thank you for teaching me what real work means." Margaret brought the photo to me, eyes wet with emotion. "He's changing, Richard. I can feel it." I studied the picture. The building behind Ethan wasn't grand, modest, functional, but beautiful in its simplicity. For the first time, I saw not the boy who had schemed, but the man who had finally built something of his own. That night, I went to my study and took out the old trust documents, the ones that had defined our boundaries. I didn't change them, not yet. But for the first time in 5 years, I placed a note inside the folder. If Ethan continues this path for another 3 years, consider limited restoration. When Margaret saw it, she didn't say a word. She just reached over, took my hand, and whispered, "That's enough. That's love." And she was right. Because forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a decision made quietly, again and again, until it no longer hurts to remember. That winter, as snow began to fall once more over the lake, Margaret and I decorated the tree together, the same one that had stood witness to betrayal years before. But this time, there were no tears, only peace. In the stillness of that evening, I realized something. Sometimes justice saves what love cannot. And sometimes love returns when justice has done its job.